Welcome, dear reader. You are about to step into a world where crystal chandeliers cast their cold light over warm secrets, where champagne flows freely but trust does not, and where the most dangerous thing in the room is not the knife, it is the smile. Tonight, we find ourselves at Ashworth Manor on the grandest night of the season. The ballroom gleams, the orchestra plays, and somewhere among the glittering guests, a killer waits patiently, dressed in silk, wearing a smile, and counting the beats of the final waltz. This is the story of one night, one necklace, one murder, and one very particular Belgian detective, with his little grey cells, his magnificent moustaches, and his absolute faith that the truth, no matter how elegantly it is buried, always rises to the surface. Shall we begin? The night Ashworth Manor breathed gold. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks prior, slipped beneath the door of Hercule Poirot's flat on Whitehaven Mansions, like a secret that did not quite trust the postman. It was a heavy card, the sort that cost more than a working man's weekly wages, embossed in gold ink, smelling faintly of expensive perfume, and bearing the unmistakable crest of the Ashworth family. You are cordially invited to the annual Ashworth Winter Ball. Saturday, the 14th of December, 1952. Ashworth Manor, Devonshire, black tie. 8 o'clock. Poirot had turned the card over in his small, neat fingers, studied it for a moment, longer than most people would consider necessary, and then placed it precisely, perfectly parallel to the edge of his writing desk. Curious, he had murmured to himself, not the invitation itself, but the fact that Lady Ashworth had seen fit to send it personally, rather than through her social secretary, as she had always done in previous years. A small thing. Perhaps nothing. But Hercule Poirot had built his entire career on the foundation of small things that turned out to be everything. Ashworth Manor in December was, by any measure, a spectacular sight. It rose from the Devonshire countryside like something conjured from a fairy tale. All grey stone and tall windows, its east wing draped in climbing ivy that had long since surrendered its summer green and gone the color of dried blood. Frost clung to the iron gate posts. The long gravel driveway had been lined with burning torches for the occasion, their flames guttering in the cold December wind, casting a restless, flickering gold across the faces of the arriving guests. Poirot stepped from the hired car with the particular care of a man who does not wish to soil his patent leather shoes on gravel. He straightened his coat, a fine black wool, recently pressed, adjusted his white tie, touched the tips of his mustaches once with a gloved finger, and surveyed the scene before him. It was, he thought, very grand. Perhaps a little too grand. He had attended many such evenings over the years. The faces changed, younger ones replacing older ones with the quiet efficiency of seasons. But the essential nature of these gatherings never altered. Wealth on display. Old alliances maintained, new ones carefully negotiated over glasses of Veuve Clicquot, and underneath it all, always, the invisible architecture of envy, ambition, and old grudges dressed in evening wear. Poirot did not particularly enjoy balls. His feet, for one thing, were not designed by nature for dancing, and the noise, the music, the laughter, the persistent roar of too many conversations happening simultaneously. It disrupted the orderly processes of his mind. But Lady Ashworth had asked him personally, and there had been something in her voice when she telephoned, beneath the practiced lightness of her social manner, that had sounded very much like fear. Inside, Ashworth Manor delivered precisely what its exterior had promised. The entrance hall alone was enough to silence most visitors. A soaring double-height space with a black and white marble floor, twin staircases curving upward on either side like the arms of a welcoming embrace, and a chandelier above that contained, Poirot estimated, no fewer than 400 individual crystals, each one catching the candlelight and throwing it back in 1,000 directions at once. Guests moved through the space with the particular confidence of people who were entirely accustomed to beautiful rooms. The women wore gowns in deep jewel tones, emerald, burgundy, midnight blue, their shoulders bare despite the December cold, their necks and wrists weighted with diamonds and pearls. The men were uniformly black and white, like chess pieces, distinguished from one another only by the subtle details of their bearing and the quality of their boredom. A string quartet played in the corner of the entrance hall, barely audible above the conversation. Somewhere beyond the double doors at the far end, a full orchestra was warming up, the sound drifting through like a promise. Poirot accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, more for occupation than consumption, and began, quietly and methodically, to observe. Lady Constance Ashworth found him within minutes. She had always been a woman of considerable presence, tall, silver-haired, in her middle 60s now, with the posture of a woman who had been told since childhood that she must never slouch, and had taken the instruction rather more seriously than most. She wore black tonight, which Poirot noted. Black at one's own ball was an unusual choice. Monsieur Poirot, she extended her hand. Her grip, when he took it, was steady. But her eyes, he noticed immediately, were not. Lady Ashworth. He inclined his head. A magnificent evening. Yes. She glanced around the room briefly, a survey that managed to be both proprietorial and nervous at once. Yes, it is, isn't it? I am glad you came. I would not have missed it, Poirot said, which was not entirely true, but was the correct thing to say. She leaned very slightly toward him, a movement so small that no one standing nearby would have registered it. I need to speak with you, properly, later this evening, when I can get away from. She gestured vaguely at the room, at the guests, at the whole shimmering machinery of the ball. There is something I should have told you when I telephoned. Something I perhaps ought to have mentioned before tonight. Poirot looked at her steadily. Is it about the necklace? Lady Ashworth's composure, considerable, hard one, decades in the making, flickered just perceptibly. How did you? I did not know, Poirot said simply, until this moment. She stared at him. Then, very quietly, she said, yes, it is about the necklace. Before she could say anything further, they were interrupted. A young woman appeared at Lady Ashworth's elbow, with the force of someone who had never in her life considered that her arrival might be unwelcome. Miss Vivian Ashworth was 26 years old, and the sort of beautiful that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without her having to ask. She had her grandmother's height and her late mother's coloring, dark hair worn in loose waves, eyes of a particular shade of gray-green that shifted with the light, a complexion that required nothing from the expensive bottles on her dressing table. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue, which struck Poirot as either very deliberate or very coincidental. and around her neck, catching the light of 400 chandelier crystals and sending it blazing outward in every direction at once, was the Ashworth sapphire necklace. Poirot had read about it, of course. Everyone had read about it. 18 sapphires of extraordinary quality, set in platinum and old rose gold. The centerpiece stone, a deep cornflower, blue the size of a man's thumbnail, surrounded by a constellation of smaller diamonds. It had been in the Ashworth family for 3 generations, acquired, the polite word, by the first Lord Ashworth during his years in India. It was insured, he believed, for somewhere in the region of £40,000. It was the kind of object that inspired the word magnificent and quietly suggested several darker words beneath it. Grand-mère, Vivienne said, kissing Lady Ashworth's cheek with the efficient affection of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing one. The Hendersons have arrived. You ought to go. She glanced at Poirot with bright, unreadable eyes. And who is this? Monsieur Hercule Poirot, Lady Ashworth said, an old friend. Vivienne studied him for a moment, the neat small figure, the magnificent moustaches, the dark eyes that were currently studying her, with rather more attention than she was, perhaps accustomed to receiving from elderly Belgian gentlemen. Something shifted in her expression. The detective, she said. Retired, Poirot said pleasantly. Vivienne smiled. It was a very good smile, practiced, warm, entirely opaque. How fascinating, she said, and then she was gone, moving back into the crowd with the ease of someone entirely at home in it, the sapphires blazing at her throat. Lady Ashworth watched her go. When she turned back to Poirot, the fear in her eyes had sharpened into something more specific. Later, she said quietly, we must talk. We, said Poirot. We must. He spent the next hour circulating. This was, in his experience, the most productive thing one could do at a gathering of this nature. Not seeking out conversations, precisely, but allowing them to find him. Standing at the margins of groups, accepting a second glass of champagne he did not drink, wearing the expression of a mildly interested elderly gentleman who posed no threat to anyone. In this way, without appearing to try, he assembled a picture. The guests tonight numbered perhaps 80. Among them, several drew his attention more than others. There was Mr. Roland Ashworth, Vivienne's uncle, Lady Ashworth's only surviving son, a man of 50 with the look of someone who had once been handsome and was, now mostly just tired. He stood near the fireplace in the entrance hall, holding his drink with the careful precision of a man monitoring his own consumption, and watching his niece move through the room with an expression Poirot could not immediately classify. Not affection, not hostility, something more complicated than either. There was Dr. Felix Hartley, introduced to Poirot by a mutual acquaintance as the family physician, a lean, quiet man in his mid-40s with attentive eyes and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. He spoke little. He observed much. Poirot recognized the type, having something of it himself. There was Miss Clara Bryce, Vivienne's companion, and, according to whispered information, gathered from 2 separate sources within 30 minutes. Formerly her closest friend, currently occupying a position of rather more ambiguous social standing. She was pretty in a faded, apologetic sort of way, wearing a gown that was perfectly adequate, and somehow made that fact feel sad. She watched Vivienne constantly, with an expression that mixed devotion and something rawer in proportions that seemed to shift depending on the moment. And there was Mr. Anthony Hale, young, dark-haired, with the lean energy of a man who did not quite fit inside his evening clothes, as though his body had more important business to be getting on with. He was paying court to Vivian with the focused intensity of someone who had been doing so for some time and had not yet received a conclusive answer. Vivian received his attention with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing admirers since the age of 17 and had developed a system. These were the ones Poirot noted. There were others, of course. There are always others. But these were the ones his mind returned to, without quite knowing why. Not yet. At 9:30, the double doors to the ballroom were opened and the orchestra struck up the first waltz of the evening. The crowd moved through the doors in a glittering tide, and Poirot moved with it, carried along by the current, his champagne glass still in his hand, and his grey cells working quietly and steadily beneath the surface of his pleasant, unremarkable expression. Ashworth Manor's ballroom was the finest room in a house of fine rooms. The floor was pale oak, polished to a mirror shine. The ceiling was painted. Pastoral scenes in the style of the previous century, shepherdesses and blue skies that had faded gracefully with age. Along both long walls, tall windows looked out onto the darkened gardens, reflecting the room back at itself in the glass. And at the far end, on a raised dais, the orchestra played, 12 musicians in white tie. Their conductor, a small, energetic man, who addressed his ensemble with the passion of someone for whom this waltz was the most important thing currently happening in the world. Perhaps, Poirot thought, for someone in this room tonight, it would turn out to be exactly that. He found a position near the wall where he could see the room without being required to participate in it, and he watched. Vivian Ashworth took the floor with Anthony Hale. The sapphires caught the light. Every eye in the room found her briefly before courtesy directed them elsewhere. Poirot's eyes did not move elsewhere. He watched, and he thought, and somewhere at the back of his mind, in the particular region where Hercule Poirot stored his unresolved questions, something was beginning, very quietly, very slowly, to stir. The necklace, with a history. There is a particular kind of object in this world that carries weight beyond its physical mass, a weight made not of gold or stone, but of everything that has happened around it, every hand that has held it, every throat it has graced, every desire it has kindled. The Ashworth sapphire necklace was precisely such an object. Poirot had been watching the way people looked at it all evening. Most guests glanced at it the way one glances at a famous painting, with appreciation, perhaps a flicker of envy, and then moved on. But there were others whose gaze lingered, who looked and looked away, and then looked again. These were the ones who had a history with it. The necklace had been in the Ashworth family for 3 generations. It had passed to Lady Constance upon her marriage, and she had worn it with confidence for 20 years. Then, 12 years ago, it became the subject of a dispute. The late Lord Ashworth's will had specified that the necklace pass directly to his granddaughter Vivian, not to his son Roland. Roland had not taken this well. The matter had been settled legally 4 years ago in Vivian's favor. Lady Ashworth had chosen tonight to make that final. Roland Ashworth found Poirot at the refreshment table. Up close, he was a more complicated figure than he had appeared from across the room. Tired, but with something compressed beneath it, like a spring held down by a heavy hand. "The necklace," Roland said. "It should by rights have come to me." He caught himself. Legally, it went to Vivienne. "I made my peace with that." He did not sound like a man who had made his peace with that. "Her mother was wearing it when she died," Roland added quietly. "4 years ago, fell down the east staircase. Accident, the inquest said." He looked into his glass. "It's a heavy thing to put around a young woman's neck." Figuratively speaking, he excused himself, leaving Poirot with a full glass and a considerably fuller mind. Miss Clara Bryce appeared at his elbow shortly after, with the slightly breathless quality of someone who had been working up to something and decided to do it before her courage failed. "You're Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Vivienne pointed you out. She said you were a detective." "Retired," Poirot said. Clara twisted her evening bag in her hands. "I wrote to Lady Ashworth 2 weeks ago. I told her I had concerns about the necklace being worn tonight." She dropped her voice, a feeling that something was not right, that someone wanted to take it, and didn't care very much what they had to do to get it. The orchestra reassembled on the dais. The third waltz began, slow and sweeping, filling the ballroom like rising water. Poirot looked at Vivienne Ashworth, and at the sapphires burning blue at her throat, and at the faces of the people watching her. Someone in this room, he thought, is not here for the dancing. The last waltz, there is a moment in every ball, every gathering of this particular kind, when the evening tips, when the champagne has flowed long enough that the careful architecture of social behavior begins to show its seams, when smiles become slightly too wide or slightly too fixed, when voices rise a half note higher than propriety strictly recommends, when the masks, in other words, begin to slip. Poirot had attended enough such evenings to recognize this moment precisely. It came at Ashworth Manor at approximately 11 o'clock. He knew it not because of any single dramatic event, but because of a collection of small things that his observant eyes registered in the space of perhaps 10 minutes. Roland Ashworth, near the far window, speaking in low, rapid tones to Dr. Hartley, who was listening with the particular stillness of a man receiving information he did not entirely welcome. Anthony Hale, who had been at Vivienne's side for most of the evening, suddenly and conspicuously absent, his champagne glass still half full, abandoned on a side table near the ballroom entrance. Clara Bryce, who had stationed herself unobtrusively near the refreshment table for the past hour, now moving quietly, purposefully, toward the corridor that led to the east wing. And Lady Ashworth herself, who had been circulating with the tireless grace of an experienced hostess, now standing quite still near the ballroom doors, watching her granddaughter dance with an expression that was, Poirot thought, not entirely the expression of a proud grandmother. It was the expression of a woman who was afraid she had made a mistake. Vivienne danced the fifth waltz with a young man Poirot did not recognize. Someone's nephew, he thought, or a minor connection of the family, invited to make up numbers. It did not matter. What mattered was that she danced it alone, in the sense that counted, without anyone close enough to her to notice the precise moment her expression changed. Poirot noticed. It was subtle, The kind of thing that would not have registered for most observers, lost as it was in the movement and the music and the general radiance of a young woman who wore 40,000 pounds of sapphires as though they were glass beads from a market stall. But Poirot's eyes had spent 40 years training themselves to catch precisely these small, unguarded alterations in human expression. Midway through the waltz, Vivienne's eyes moved to the window on the east side of the ballroom. She held that look for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she returned her attention to her dancing partner with a smile that was absolutely perfect and entirely empty. Something had passed between her and the window, or whoever lay beyond it. A signal, perhaps, a recognition, something that had caused, for 3 unguarded seconds, the performance to pause. Poirot began, quietly, to move toward the east side of the room. He did not reach the window. He was intercepted, there was no other word for it, by Anthony Hale, who reappeared from the corridor with the particular energy of someone who had just had a conversation that had gone badly. His color was slightly heightened. His white tie, Poirot noticed, was fractionally less perfect than it had been an hour ago. The knot shifted, slightly left as though a hand had been laid on his collar with some force and then removed. "Monsieur Poirot." Hale stopped. He seemed briefly surprised by his own action, as though he had moved toward Poirot on instinct rather than intention. He stopped. "Mr. Hale," Poirot said pleasantly. "You are enjoying the evening?" Hale looked at him. He was, Poirot thought, a young man under considerable internal pressure. The kind that builds when one is in possession of information one does not quite know what to do with. "Where is Vivienne?" he asked. Poirot indicated, with a slight movement of his head, the dance floor. Hale's eyes found her immediately, with the automatic precision of someone who had been tracking her position all evening. "She's all right," he said, and it was not quite clear whether this was a question or an attempt to reassure himself. "She appears to be in excellent health," Poirot said, "though I confess I have been finding the room rather warm. You yourself look as though you have had some fresh air, perhaps?" Hale looked at him sharply. "I stepped out for a moment. The east corridor it was." He stopped. "Stuffy, of course," Poirot said. Hale looked as though he wanted to say something further, wrestled with it briefly, and then apparently decided against it. "I should go back to her," he said. "Yes," Poirot agreed. "I think perhaps you should." He watched Hale move back toward the dance floor, and he thought about the east corridor, and what one might find there if one went to look, and whether now was the right moment to go and look, or whether patience was the wiser course. He decided, as he usually did in these situations, on patience. This was, he would reflect later, one of his rare mistakes of the evening. The 6th waltz was the last. This was traditional at Ashworth balls. Lady Ashworth had told him so on the telephone in passing, the detail seeming unimportant at the time. 6 waltzes, then supper, then the guests would begin to depart. It was 11:30 now. The evening was drawing toward its conclusion. With the stately inevitability of all formal occasions, the orchestra announced the final waltz with a brief, ceremonial chord, a signal that produced a small, general movement across the ballroom as couples assembled and the uninvolved drifted to the margins. Vivienne Ashworth did not immediately take the floor. Poirot watched her. She stood near the center of the room, her dance partner from the previous waltz already retreating, and she was, for just a moment, still, looking at something or someone across the room. Then Anthony Hale appeared at her side, offered his hand with the formal little bow that the occasion demanded, and she smiled, that perfect, practiced smile, and took it. They moved onto the floor together. The music began properly, a slow, sweeping waltz, the kind that transforms even indifferent dancers into something graceful. Under the 400 crystals of the chandelier, in her sapphire gown with the great necklace blazing at her throat, Vivian Ashworth was, objectively, a magnificent sight. Poirot watched for approximately 45 seconds. Then he turned and walked, quickly and quietly, toward the east corridor. The east corridor was dim. The wall sconces turned low, as they always were in the parts of the house not currently in use. It stretched away from the ballroom entrance in a long, straight line, carpeted in dark red, lined with ancestral portraits that watched Poirot's passage with the painted indifference of the long dead. Halfway along the corridor, there was a door. It led, Poirot knew from his earlier reconnaissance of the house. He always made a quiet study of the floor plan before any significant occasion, a habit so ingrained as to be automatic, to a small anteroom that the Ashworth family used variously as a card room, a quiet sitting room, and, on ball nights, a temporary cloakroom for the overcoats of early arriving guests. The door was not quite closed. A thin line of light showed at its edge. Poirot paused outside it. He could hear, very faintly beneath the distant orchestra, voices, 2 of them, low, rapid, urgent. He could not make out the words. He stood for a moment in the dim corridor, considering. Then he placed one small, neat hand on the door and pushed it gently open. The anteroom was a comfortable, slightly cluttered space. A fireplace, 2 armchairs, a round table, a rack of coats along one wall. The fire had burned low and was giving more shadow than light. The room was empty. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment, frowning. He was quite certain he had heard voices. He had not imagined them. His hearing was still excellent, whatever other concessions age had begun to extract from him. And the light. He had seen the light under the door. He stepped inside. The fire shifted, settled. Outside, muffled and remote, the final waltz played on. He examined the room with care. 2 armchairs slightly displaced from their usual position, the indentations in the carpet clear enough. The fire, recently attended. Someone had added coal not long ago, and on the small table, 2 glasses, both used, both empty. Someone had been here, 2 people, and they had left. Through where? The window, perhaps. He crossed to it. It looked out onto the east terrace. The latch, when he examined it, was not fully engaged. Someone had gone through this window recently enough that the cold air outside had not yet entirely dissipated from the room. Poirot stood at the window and looked out at the dark terrace, and thought about who had been here and why they had left so quickly, and what they had been saying in voices too low for him to hear. He stood there perhaps 2 minutes longer than he should have. He was still standing there when, from the distant ballroom, the music stopped, not at its natural conclusion. The waltz was not yet over. It simply stopped mid-phrase with the abruptness of something interrupted, and then, cutting through the sudden silence with the clarity of a bell, came the sound that Hercule Poirot had, for the past 3 hours, been half expecting and entirely hoping not to hear. A scream. He moved faster than a man of his age, and build was generally assumed capable of moving. Along the dim corridor, past the indifferent portraits, through the double doors and into the blazing light of the ballroom. The scene he entered was one he would carry with him for a considerable time afterward. The orchestra, instruments lowered, staring at the dance floor. The guests frozen in a rough circle, their faces wearing the identical expression of people who have witnessed something they cannot yet fully process. The chandelier still blazing above, its 400 crystals throwing their cold, indifferent light downward. And in the center of the dance floor, on the polished pale oak that had been mirror-bright an hour ago, Vivian Ashworth. She lay on her back, quite still, one arm extended, her sapphire gown spread around her. Her dark hair had come loose from its arrangement. Her eyes were open, fixed on the painted ceiling above. The shepherdesses and blue sky of the previous century, faded and serene. The sapphire necklace was at her throat, and Vivian Ashworth was dead. Poirot crossed the floor. The crowd parted for him, not because they knew who he was, but because he moved with the absolute certainty of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, and crowds invariably defer to that quality. He knelt beside her. His knees, which objected to this in the mornings, objected now as well, but he paid them no attention. He examined her quickly, carefully, without touching more than was necessary. No visible wound, no blood on the pale oak floor, no sign of a struggle. Her gown was disarranged only by her fall, and her fall, from the evidence, had been straight down where she stood. A waltz partner who has been standing beside her and cannot entirely meet anyone's eyes. Poirot looked up. Has anyone summoned the police? A silence. Someone must telephone the police, he said, with the particular quality of authority that does not require volume. And no one. He looked around the circle of frozen, glittering faces. No one is to leave this room. His eyes moved across them. Roland Ashworth, white-faced near the fireplace. Dr. Hartley, already moving forward with his bag. He had had it brought from his car, Poirot noted, at some point during the evening. Clara Bryce, both hands pressed over her mouth, her honest eyes bright with tears. Anthony Hale, standing 3 feet from Vivienne's body, looking down at her with an expression that Poirot could not, at this precise moment, read. And Lady Ashworth in the doorway, in her black gown, very still, looking at her granddaughter on the floor and at the sapphires blazing at her throat with an expression that was beyond grief, that had gone somewhere past grief into a place that had no name. Poirot rose slowly from his knees. His mind was very quiet, very clear. The little gray cells which had been working patiently all evening in the background came now to the foreground with the purposeful efficiency of trained soldiers called to order. He looked at the necklace. He looked at the faces. He looked at the door to the east corridor, which he had left open behind him, and which someone had since closed, and Hercule Poirot began, in earnest, to think. The little grey cells go. To work, Inspector Gerald Crome of the Devonshire Constabulary arrived at Ashworth Manor at 12 minutes past midnight. He was a tall man with a clipped grey moustache, accompanied by a young constable carrying a notebook and wearing the expression of someone experiencing their first murder. Crome's eyes found Poirot immediately and stopped. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, with the flatness of a man who had been hoping for a straightforward evening. "Inspector Crome, there is much to discuss." "I'm sure there is," Crome said. He had worked with Poirot once before and had come away with a healthy respect for the Belgian's abilities and a somewhat strained relationship with his own professional confidence. Crome proceeded systematically, examined the body, conferred with Dr. Hartley, began taking statements from guests. Poirot used the waiting time productively. Dr. Hartley's preliminary assessment was quiet and precise. No external wound, no signs of physical violence. "The presentation is consistent with poisoning. She was dancing. Warm, elevated heart rate. That accelerates absorption. Whatever she was given would have acted faster than under ordinary circumstances." "The method of administration?" Poirot asked. "Something ingested, or possibly absorbed through skin contact." Hartley glanced at the necklace. "Or injected, though that would require considerable nerve in a crowded ballroom." "Yes," Poirot said quietly, "it would." He moved through the reduced ballroom, with his hands clasped behind his back, assembling the evening in his mind. He knew certain things. Vivienne had been poisoned during the final waltz or shortly before it. The anteroom in the east corridor had been occupied by two people who left through the window, suggesting secrecy or haste. Anthony Hale had been in that same corridor with a disarranged collar and a reluctance to explain it. Hartley and Roland had been in urgent conversation at 11 o'clock. Clara had written to Lady Ashworth with genuine fears 2 weeks before the ball, and the necklace was at the center of all of it, not merely as a motive, as something more specific. The mechanism, perhaps. He stopped walking. He crossed to the evidence table where the necklace now lay and studied the clasp carefully. "Inspector," he said. Crome looked up from his interview with Roland. Something in Poirot's tone brought him across the room without objection. "What am I looking at?" "The clasp," Poirot said. "There is a small reservoir integrated into the mechanism, very well concealed." He indicated with one precise finger without touching. "Recently emptied." Crome leaned closer, then straightened with an expression that had moved from skepticism through surprise and arrived at alarm. "Good God! The clasp rests against the skin of the neck," Poirot said. "A small puncture, barely perceptible over the course of an active evening. The warmth of the skin, the movement of the dance." He paused. "A most elegant method, and a most cold-blooded one. Get the surgeon here," Crome said sharply to his constable. "Now, Inspector." Poirot touched his arm. "The necklace was worn tonight for the first time in 4 years. Whoever modified that clasp either did so more than 4 years ago, or they did so recently, within the last 3 weeks, since the ball was announced." He paused, which considerably narrows the question of who. He straightened his cuffs. "Now we must speak to the people in this house, one by one. Because someone knew 3 weeks ago that Vivienne would wear this necklace tonight, and used that knowledge to commit a murder planned with exceptional care." He turned toward the door where the guests were still assembled and waiting. "Come," he said, "let us go and ask some questions, and let us listen not only to the answers. The answers are the least interesting part. Let us listen to what is not said." They began with Roland Ashworth. He sat in a high-backed chair with a brandy in his hand, and the collapsed quality of someone from whom great tension had been suddenly removed. but his eyes were alert enough. "Where were you between 11 and 11:30? Poirot asked. "Here, in the ballroom. For the entirety of that period?" A slight pause. "Mostly. And the part that was not mostly?" "I stepped out. The east corridor. I needed air." "And did you step into the anteroom?" Roland looked up sharply. "How did you?" The fire had been recently tended. 2 glasses on the table. The window latch open. Poirot tilted his head. "Who were you speaking with?" Roland was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Dr. Hartley." "And what did you discuss?" Roland looked at him. Behind the tiredness and the brandy, Poirot saw the expression of a man calculating how much more he could afford to keep to himself. "The necklace," Roland said at last. "Yes," said Poirot very quietly. "I thought it might be. Everyone has. A secret, but something was missing. Something sitting at the edge of his understanding, declining to come closer. It would come. It always came. One simply had to be patient." Dr. Hartley came into the small sitting room with the composure of a man who had decided exactly how much he was going to say. He sat, declined a drink, and folded his hands on his knee with the stillness of someone who does not wish to give anything away through them. "You were in the anteroom with Roland between 11 and 11:20, Poirot said. "The subject, the necklace." Roland had come to me with concerns. He had sighed in a manner suggesting deliberate harm. The silence that followed was the most eloquent thing Hartley had said all evening. "You did nothing," Poirot said, not harshly, as a statement of fact. "We discussed it, whether the modification was perhaps old, historical, something that no longer contained anything," Poirot said. "And you left through the window because you did not wish to be seen together. Because you had not yet decided what answers you were prepared to give." Hartley said nothing. "Dr. Hartley, a young woman is dead. There is nothing to protect now. That possibility ended tonight." Poirot leaned forward. "What do you know?" "All of it." Hartley looked at his hands for a long... Poirot asked. "The east corridor. I saw Roland go in that direction. I had reasons to want to know what he was doing. Your collar was disarranged when you returned. I caught it on the door frame. Mr. Hale. Roland Ashworth believes you tampered with the necklace, that you are responsible for Miss Vivian's death." The effect was immediate. A full-body recoil, color draining from his face. "That is insane." His hands gripped the chair arms. "I loved her. I would never..." He stopped. Swallowed. "Roland hated her. Did he tell you that? He'd spent 4 years watching £40,000 walk a man who had simply had some air. It was the expression of a man who was afraid." Hale stared at him. "What did you hear, Mr. Hale?" A long silence. Then, "I heard Roland say her name, Vivian. And then, tonight." And then Hartley said something I couldn't make out. And Roland said it again. "Tonight." He closed his eyes briefly. "I heard them move toward the window, and I stepped back so they wouldn't see me. I went back to the ballroom to find her, to stay close to her." He opened his eyes. "I should have told someone. I know that." "Yes," Poirot said gently. "You should have." Clara Bryce was waiting in the entrance valuation. "I saw the aperture in the clasp. It was too regular, too intentional. It frightened me, so I wrote." "And Lady Ashworth's response?" Clara's hands tightened in her lap. "She thanked me and said she would look into it. And then she still let Vivian wear it." "Did you tell anyone else before writing to Lady Ashworth?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I told Vivienne." Poirot went very still. "And what did Vivienne say?" Clara met his eyes. In her expression, grief, guilt, and beneath it all a kind of bewildered love. Poirot read the answer before she spoke it. "She said she knew," Clara whispered. "She saw the truth settle into place around him, solid, complete, and considerably darker than he had expected." The wrong man. Poirot slept badly. This was not unusual when a case had reached the particular stage this one had reached, the stage at which the broad shape of the truth was visible, but the final, essential detail remained just beyond the fingertips. His mind, on these occasions, refused the ordinary courtesies of rest. It continued working through the night with the relentless industry of a mill that does not stop simply because the miller has gone to bed. He had been given a room in Ashworth Manor's West Wing. She said she knew, had rearranged everything. Not dramatically, not with the sudden earthquake quality of a revelation that destroys all previous understanding. More like the turning of a lens, a small, precise adjustment that brought everything previously blurred into sudden, sharp focus. Vivienne had known about the modification to the clasp. She had known, and she had told Clara not to worry. She had said she had it in hand. She had not been afraid. What did this mean? It meant, and here Poirot turned the lens another fraction, that Vivienne Ashworth had known about the modified clasp and had chosen for her own death. He was not yet suggesting that, but for... He set down his teacup. He thought about the necklace, about its history, about the will that had given it to Vivienne over Roland's objection, about the insurance valuation that had brought it down from the safe 10 days before the ball, about the fact that it was valued at £40,000. He thought about the insurance valuation. He thought about what a jeweler examining the necklace for an insurance company would look at, and whether in the course of that examination something might have been discovered or exchanged. Or Poirot stood up, telephoned at 6:30 in the morning. But he was sufficiently awake to answer the questions put to him, and his answers were illuminating. The modification to the clasp, as Poirot described it, working from his own observation, was, Pemberton said, consistent with work he had seen before. Not common work, specialized. There was a man, he said, a retired jeweler turned instrument maker, who had produced similar modifications on 2 or 3 occasions over the past decade. The work was his signature. Pemberton knew of him because one of these previous modifications had come to light under the knowledge to understand what the modification meant and the professional conscience that made it impossible to simply walk away. Had argued with him. They had left through the window because they intended to go to Vivienne, to warn her, to stop it, and they had been too late. It was, Poirot thought, a coherent and evidenced reconstruction of events. It fitted the facts. It explained the behavior of everyone involved. It produced a clear suspect with clear means, motive, and a traceable connection to the method. Inspector Crome, when presented with this reconstruction over breakfast in the dining room, his face was very pale. His eyes, passing briefly over Poirot as he descended the stairs, held an expression that Poirot would spend the next several hours finding faintly troubling. Not guilt, not anger, not the calculation of a man working out how to defend himself. Something closer to confusion. Lady Ashworth was in the drawing-room when it happened. She had been there since early morning. Poirot understood. She had not slept at all. She heard the sounds in the hallway, and she did not come out. She simply sat in the drawing room, in the same black gown she had worn the night before, looking at the wall. "Lady Ashworth," he began. "Monsieur Poirot." Her voice was very quiet. "I should like to tell you something. Something I should perhaps have told you last night." She looked up at him. "About Vivienne." Poirot sat down. He was suddenly, in a way that was not quite fear and not quite certainty, but something between the two, very still. "Vivienne," Lady Ashworth said, "had been asking me, for the past 8 months, to remove the necklace from the terms of the will. She wanted it sold. She wanted the money. She had plans, investments, something she was involved in with," she paused, "with a business associate. She paused. "His name was a professional acquaintance. He dealt in antique instruments. And before that, I believe, he had been a jeweler." The drawing room was very quiet. "She was going to claim the insurance," Poirot said. "Not a question." "I believe so," Lady Ashworth said. "Stage a theft, most likely. Wear the necklace to the ball, the most public possible occasion, and then report it stolen. £40,000. Enough for whatever scheme she and her associate had constructed." She looked at her hands again. "The modification to the clasp. I think that was something else." He rose to his feet. "Inspector Crome," he said, "must release Roland Ashworth." Lady Ashworth looked at him. "You know who did it." "I am beginning to," Poirot said. "Though it is not," he paused, and for a moment something crossed his face that was not quite his usual composed certainty. A flicker of something more human, more troubled. "It is not what I expected." He was halfway to the door when he stopped, turned back. "The business associate," he said. "Vivienne's." "What was his name?" Lady Ashworth told him. Poirot stood very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, and to no one in particular, "Of course, the grey cells speak." The name Lady Ashworth had given him was Crane. Not Aldous Crane, the jeweler, the retired craftsman in Exeter whom Pemberton had identified, his son. Edward Crane, 34 years old, currently presenting himself to the world as an antique instrument dealer, with premises in Bath, a persuasive manner, and the kind of surface charm that tends to accumulate around people who have learned early that charm is more useful than honesty. Poirot knew the name. Not well, but enough. 3 years ago, on the periphery of a case he had consulted on for a firm of London solicitors, a matter of a forged will and a missing emerald brooch. The name Edward Crane had appeared briefly, and then disappeared again, like a fish surfacing once before returning to deep water. Nothing had been proven. Nothing had even been formally alleged, but the name had registered, in the way that certain names register with Poirot, filed carefully, held lightly, kept available. He climbed the stairs to the east wing with his hand on the banister and his mind running ahead of him, assembling the final shape of it. Edward Crane had been Vivienne's business associate, her partner in whatever scheme she had constructed around the necklace and the insurance money. He was the son of the craftsman who had done the modification, a man who would know exactly what his father's work looked like, how it functioned, what it was capable of. The essential question that Poirot had been circling since Lady Ashworth spoke the name, was this: had the modification to the clasp been part of the insurance scheme? Or had it been something else entirely? Something Vivienne had not known about. Vivienne had told Clara she knew about the modification. She had said she was not afraid. This had always suggested, even when Poirot was building his case against Roland, that she understood what the modification was and believed it was under her control. What if she had been wrong about that? What if Edward Crane had told her the reservoir in the clasp was for something else? A tracking mechanism, perhaps, or a scent capsule, or any of a dozen plausible innocent explanations that a clever man might construct for a woman who trusted him, while filling it with something she did not know about. What if Vivienne Ashworth had been not the architect of her own death, but its most deceived victim? He found Anthony Hale in the East Corridor, of all places. Standing in the corridor where he had stood last night, outside the anteroom door, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man retracing steps in his mind. "Mr. Hale," Poirot said. Hale turned. He looked as though he had not slept, which Poirot thought was probably true. His evening clothes had been replaced by a plain dark suit, but it sat on him with the same slightly ill-fitting quality as everything else he wore. The quality, Poirot had decided, of a man whose mind is always somewhere more urgent than his body. "They've arrested Roland," Hale said. "Yes," Poirot said. "That was a mistake. It will be corrected." Hale stared at him. "A mistake? But you said—" "I said I was still finding out," Poirot said, which was almost but not entirely what he had said. "I have found out more since then." He paused. "Mr. Hale, did Vivienne ever mention to you a man named Edward Crane?" Something happened in Hale's face. Not the blankness of non-recognition. The other thing, the tightening, the involuntary closing off. That meant the name had landed somewhere significant. "She mentioned him," Hale said carefully, "once or twice. A business contact. She said he was helping her with an investment arrangement. And you did not like this." "I didn't know enough about him to." Hale stopped. "No, I didn't like it. I didn't like him. I met him once in Bath 3 months ago. Vivienne introduced us. He searched for the word, too smooth. The kind of smooth that takes considerable effort to maintain." His eyes met Poirot's. "The kind of smooth that means there's something underneath it that can't afford to be seen. You said nothing to Vivienne about these reservations." "I tried. He stopped again. "She told me I was jealous. That I didn't want her to have anything that wasn't connected to me." A pause. "She wasn't entirely wrong about that," which made it harder to insist. "I see," Poirot said. "And do you know, did Vivienne ever tell you where Edward Crane could be found? Did she have an address for him? A means of contact?" Hale looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because," Poirot said, "I believe Edward Crane is responsible for Vivienne's death, and I believe he was at this ball last night. Not as a guest, not on the official list, but present, nonetheless, on the terrace, in the gardens, close enough to ensure that everything proceeded as he intended." Hale was very still. "You think he was here?" "I think he was on the East Terrace," Poirot said, "at approximately 11 o'clock. I think that is what you saw, or heard, when you were standing in this corridor, not Roland and Hartley leaving through the anteroom window. Or not only that." He paused. "What else did you hear, Mr. Hale, last night, standing here?" A long silence. The East Corridor, in the grey December morning light, was very different from what it had been the night before. Stripped of its dim, romantic torchlight, reduced to plain stone and faded carpet, and the honest flatness of a winter day. "I heard someone on the terrace," Hale said finally, "outside the window. Footsteps on the stone. I thought it was Roland and Hartley. I thought they'd gone out for air, that it was nothing. But the footsteps," he frowned, "they didn't go away. They stayed, just outside the window, for longer than you'd stand on a terrace in December for air." He looked at the window at the far end of the corridor. "I thought I heard a voice, just once. Very low, I couldn't make out words." "One voice," Poirot said, "not two." "One," Hale said. "Yes, someone standing on the terrace." Poirot said quietly, more to himself than to Hale, and speaking. "Once. Briefly." He thought about that. A signal, perhaps, or a confirmation. He crossed to the corridor window and looked out. The east terrace was a broad flagstone space, enclosed on 3 sides by the Manor's walls and open on the 4th to the frost-white gardens beyond. From where he stood, he could see clearly that the terrace connected, via a short flight of steps, to a gravel path that wound around the east wing and out toward the rear gate. Someone who knew the house, or who had studied it, could have come in through the rear gate, crossed the gardens to the terrace, signaled through the anteroom window, and left the same way, without passing through any room where a guest might have seen them, without appearing on any list, without being seen at all, unless one was standing in the east corridor at precisely the right moment. "He came to check," Poirot said. "He came to ensure the mechanism had been correctly positioned, that the clasp was properly engaged, that nothing had gone wrong with his arrangement." He turned from the window. "He is a meticulous man, Edward Crane. His father's son in that respect, at least." The next 2 hours were occupied with 2 things simultaneously. Poirot coordinating with Inspector Crome, who released Roland Ashworth with the constrained expression of a man revising a firmly held position, and Poirot making 3 further telephone calls, one to Pemberton in London, one to his contact at Scotland Yard, one to a small, precise woman named Mrs. Lansing, who ran a respectable boarding house in Bath, and who had, among other qualities, an exceptional memory for the comings and goings of her guests. The calls produced the following. From Pemberton: confirmation that Edward Crane had visited his father's workshop in Exeter on 2 occasions in the past 6 months. The elder Crane, now in poor health, had received his son with a complicated mixture of pride and unease that tends to characterize the relationship between a craftsman and a child who has taken the craft in directions the father never intended. From Scotland Yard, a history of Edward Crane that was, in the language of official records, unexceptional, and in the language of what those records carefully did not say, rather more interesting. 2 investigations, both closed without charge. One, in 1948, involving an insurance claim on a piece of jewelry that had subsequently reappeared. One in 1950, involving the death of a business associate that had been ruled accidental. Though the investigating officer had noted in his report, with the careful understatement of a man who knows the difference between what he can prove and what he knows, that the circumstances had been unusual. From Mrs. Lansing: the most important thing of all, Edward Crane had vacated his room at her establishment 4 days ago. He had paid in full, been perfectly pleasant, and left no forwarding address. He had, however, left behind. Accidentally, Mrs. Lansing thought, though Poirot was less certain, A receipt from a garage in Exeter for the hire of a motor car. The hire period was specified. It ended on the 15th of December. Today was the 14th. He has not yet left the county, Poirot said to the room in general. Crome, seated across the telephone table, looked up. The hired car is due back tomorrow. He will either return it himself or abandon it, but he has not yet gone. We can put out a description, Crome said, reaching for his hat with the energy of a man glad to have something concrete to do. Circulate it to the county stations. Yes, Poirot said. Do that. He paused. And, Inspector, the garage in Exeter. Someone should go there directly, not to wait for him to return the car, to obtain the car's registration and circulate it immediately. He may decide to move sooner than planned if he has heard that an arrest has been made and then rescinded. He will know that the investigation is not settled. Crome looked at him. How would he hear that? Because, Poirot said, he has a contact in this house. He must. Someone who has been providing him with information. About the ball, about Lady Ashworth's decision to have the necklace worn, about the timing of the evening. Someone who communicated with him last night from that terrace. He paused. I know who it is. I have known since this morning. I have simply been reluctant to accept it. Crome waited. It is not relevant to the arrest, Poirot said, after a moment. The contact is not the killer. The contact is... He stopped. The contact believed they were helping Vivienne. They believed the whole arrangement was Vivienne's plan, that they were simply facilitating it. They did not know that Crane had added an element to the plan that Vivienne herself did not know about. He said this quietly, and with a particular flatness that Crome, who had learned to listen carefully to Poirot's tone, noted without commenting on. Who? Crome said. Doctor Hartley, Poirot said. He did not speak to Hartley immediately. He needed, first, to sit quietly with the complete shape of it, to walk through it from beginning to end and ensure that it held, that there were no gaps, no points at which the logic failed or an alternative explanation intruded. He found a chair in the library, a fine room, book-lined, south-facing, the winter light coming in at a low angle that turned the dust motes golden. And he sat and he thought. Hartley had been Vivienne's contact with Crane. Not knowingly complicit in murder, Poirot was certain of that. Hartley was a man of conscience, as his behavior the previous night demonstrated. However late and inadequate, that conscience had finally asserted itself. But he had been in communication with Crane. He had provided information. He had, perhaps, this Poirot was less certain of, and would need confirmation, provided access to the necklace during the insurance valuation. The necklace had been in Lady Ashworth's study. Hartley visited the house regularly, professionally. He would have had opportunity, and Vivienne had trusted him. The family trusted him. He was the family physician. 11 years of it, as he had said himself. He was the kind of presence in a household that becomes invisible through familiarity. No one watches the doctor. No one questions why he is in a particular room, or whether he has been alone with a particular object. He had not known about the poison. Poirot was nearly certain of this. He had known about the modification to the clasp. Crane had told him what it was for, and the explanation given had been the same plausible, innocent one that Crane had given Vivienne. A mechanism for the staged theft, most likely. Something that would make the insurance claim more convincing. or the theft more controllable. And when Roland had come to him in the anteroom with his own suspicious observation, Roland, who had seen enough to be worried but not enough to understand, Hartley had heard something that reconfigured everything. Roland's description of the modification, combined with Hartley's medical knowledge, had produced a conclusion that Crane's innocent explanation could no longer accommodate. He had panicked. He had tried to reach Crane. Hence, Poirot suspected. The voice Hale had heard on the terrace, low and urgent, a single brief exchange through the window, and Crane, who had no intention of stopping what he had set in motion, had either reassured him or simply disappeared back into the dark garden before Hartley could do anything effectual. And then it had been too late. Hartley had known. He had come to know in that anteroom what was really in the clasp, and he had not acted quickly enough. This was his crime, not the murder, not the planning, not the intent, but the failure, at the crucial moment, to act. To create a scene, never mind the social impropriety of it. To take the necklace physically from Vivienne's throat in the middle of the ballroom, if necessary, and explain later. He had not done it. He had been too slow, or too uncertain, or too afraid of being wrong, and Vivienne had danced the final waltz. Poirot sat with this for a long time. Then he rose, straightened his cuffs, and went to find Inspector Crome. The final curtain Edward Crane was found at 2:20 in the afternoon. Not in Exeter. Not on any road heading toward a port or a railway station, which is where Crome's men had been concentrating their attention. He was found, with the particular irony that reality reserves for its most carefully planned escapes, in a small public house called the Bell and Anchor, 4 miles from Ashworth Manor, eating a late lunch with the composed appetite of a man who believes himself entirely invisible. He was not invisible. The description Crome had circulated. Lean, dark-haired, 34, with a scar on his left hand from a workshop accident in his father's studio, had reached the publican's wife, who had the sharp eyes and sharper memory of a woman accustomed to observing strangers in her establishment and deciding whether they warranted attention. She had made a telephone call. Crome's constable had arrived within 20 minutes. Crane had not run. This too struck Poirot as instructive. He had sat at his table, finished what was on his plate, wiped his mouth with the careful deliberateness of a man who will not be hurried, and then risen and accompanied the constable, with the quiet cooperation of someone who has, at some level, been waiting for this, and has made his preparations accordingly. Poirot was not present for the arrest. He had remained at Ashworth Manor, where there was still something he needed to do. Something that was, in its way, more difficult than anything else the case had required of him. He found Dr. Hartley in the East Corridor. This was not surprising. Hartley had returned to the same stretch of corridor 3 times since the morning, to Poirot's knowledge, drawn back to the scene of his failure with the irresistible compulsion of a man who cannot stop replaying the moment at which a different choice was available to him and was not taken. He was standing at the window when Poirot came upon him, looking out at the east terrace, grey and frost-white in the afternoon light. His hands were clasped behind his back. He heard Poirot's approach and did not turn around. "You know," he said, a statement, not a question. "Yes," Poirot said. A silence. Outside, the frost-bitten garden, the terrace where a man had stood the previous night with murder already in motion, and a phone call too late to stop it. "I did not know," Hartley said, "what was in the clasp. I want you to understand that. I knew about the modification. I knew it was. I knew it was part of something that was not entirely legitimate. Vivienne had told me enough. The insurance plan, the staged theft." He paused. "I told myself it was none of my business, that she was an adult, that it concerned no one but herself and the insurance company." Another pause. "I told myself many things." "And Edward Crane," Poirot said. "He approached you, or you approached him?" "He approached me." Hartley turned from the window. His face, in the flat winter light, looked considerably older than it had the previous evening. The composure was still present. It was, Poirot thought, simply the shape of his face now, worn in by 11 years of professional practice. But beneath it something had collapsed. 8 months ago, he knew about my connection to the family. He represented himself as a business consultant. He said Vivienne had authorized him to speak with me. He met Poirot's eyes. "I checked with Vivienne. She confirmed it." "What did he ask you to do?" "Information at first. The schedule of the house, when Lady Ashworth was away, when the safe was accessed. Nothing that seemed—" He stopped. "Nothing that I allowed myself to consider properly. And then, 3 months ago, he asked me to ensure he had access to the necklace during the insurance valuation. The valuer was coming on a Tuesday afternoon. Lady Ashworth had a medical appointment that I had arranged. Not deliberately, not at that point. I thought it was coincidence, and the house would be relatively unattended." He looked at his hands. "I made certain the study door was unlocked. That is all I did. He was in and out within 15 minutes. "And you believed he was simply examining the piece," Poirot said, "for the insurance scheme." "I believed." Hartley stopped. "I allowed myself to believe what was convenient to believe. Yes." He said this without self-pity, which Poirot found more affecting than tears would have been. "When Roland came to me last night and described what he had seen, I understood immediately what the modification was for, what it contained, or could contain." He closed his eyes briefly. "I tried to reach Crane. Through the window, he was on the terrace. I had seen him from upstairs an hour before and said nothing, done nothing, told myself it was unrelated." "And he told you it was safe," Poirot said, "that the reservoir was empty. He told me I had misunderstood what Roland had seen, that the modification was structural, a reinforcement to the clasp mechanism, that there was no reservoir." Hartley's voice was very even. "He lied to me, and I wanted to be lied to, I think. I wanted there to be a simple explanation, and so I accepted one." He opened his eyes. "And then I went back to the ballroom and watched her dance." The east corridor was very quiet. "You will tell Inspector Crome all of this," Poirot said, not harshly, but without ambiguity. "Yes," Hartley said. "I know. You are not the killer," Poirot said. "That must be said clearly, and I will say it clearly to Crome. You are a man who made a series of wrong choices, and who, at the last wrong choice, lacked the courage to correct them. This is," Poirot paused, "not nothing. It is not murder, but it is not nothing." "No," Hartley agreed quietly. "It is not nothing." He straightened then. The habitual correction of posture, the physical expression of the composure that was the deepest thing in him. "I should like to speak to Lady Ashworth first, before Crome, if that is permitted." Poirot considered this. "Yes," he said, "I think that is right." The final gathering happened at 4 o'clock in the drawing room. This was Poirot's arrangement, accepted by Crome with the experienced resignation of a man who has learned that these gatherings are going to happen regardless, and that it is better to be present and in control of one than to arrive afterward and reconstruct from accounts. Crome sat near the fireplace. His constable sat near the door. The remaining principals assembled in the arrangement that such gatherings always produce, some seated, some standing, all carrying the specific gravity of people who know that something conclusive is about to be said. Lady Ashworth in the high-backed chair nearest the window. Roland, beside her, released, pale, bearing the particular quality of someone who has been briefly and incorrectly accused of murder and is still absorbing the experience. Anthony Hale standing near the bookcase, his hands in his pockets, his dark eyes moving between Poirot and the door with the restless attention of a man waiting for something. Clara Bryce on the small sofa, her honest eyes red but steady. Dr. Hartley in the chair furthest from the fire, sitting very still. Poirot stood in the center of the room. He had refused a chair. He preferred, at these moments, to be on his feet. It was easier, standing, to see all the faces simultaneously, and the faces were always where the final confirmations were found. He looked at them for a moment before he began. The winter light was failing now, the short December afternoon already moving toward its early dark, and someone had lit the lamps, which cast a warm, enclosed light over the room that was at odds with what was about to be said in it. "I will tell you," Poirot said, "what happened. All of it. Not because I enjoy these performances. I do not, whatever people may assume. But because there are several people in this room who deserve to understand what was done, and why, and by whom. And one person who deserves to hear it said aloud, in company, so that there is no possibility of later minimizing it in his own mind." He did not look at Hartley when he said this last. He did not need to. He felt the slight shift in the room that meant everyone else had. He told it from the beginning. From Edward Crane's approach to Hartley 8 months ago, to Vivienne's insurance scheme, to the modification of the clasp, to the ball and the waltz, and the final terrible efficiency of a mechanism that had been designed to kill one specific person at one specific moment, and had done so with the cold precision of a plan that had been months in the making. He told it plainly, without flourish, in the manner of a man stating facts rather than constructing a narrative. This was deliberate. The facts, on this occasion, required no embellishment. They were sufficiently terrible already. Edward Crane, he explained, had seen an opportunity in Vivienne's scheme and had constructed his own within it. Vivienne had wanted to stage a theft and claim the insurance on a necklace she could not otherwise access. Crane had offered to facilitate this. He had arranged the modification through his father's skills and his own knowledge. He had told Vivienne the reservoir was part of the staging mechanism, a device to release a compound that would cause a temporary discoloration of the stones, making them easier to identify if the fictitious thief attempted to sell them. A plausible explanation. The kind of explanation that satisfies because it fits the existing plan so neatly. What Vivienne had not known was that the compound Crane had loaded into the reservoir was not a dye. It was something rather more permanent, and Crane's interest in the necklace was not the staged insurance theft. It was something simpler and older. Crane, Poirot said, had been Vivienne's partner. Not in business only, personally, some years before the period we have been discussing. The relationship had ended on Vivienne's initiative and had ended badly. There were financial matters unresolved. And there was, Poirot paused, the particular type of injury that a certain type of man sustains when a woman decides she has finished with him and acts accordingly. He let that settle. He constructed an arrangement that gave him two things simultaneously: the opportunity to be the instrument of Vivienne's death, without being present when it occurred, and a financial benefit, because Vivienne had made him the beneficiary of a small private insurance policy she had taken out 6 months ago on the advice of a business associate she trusted entirely. Believing it to be a routine commercial precaution, Poirot's voice remained even. The sum was not £40,000, but it was not negligible. Roland Ashworth made a sound, not quite a word, not quite not. Clara Bryce pressed her hands together in her lap. He had planned it for months, Poirot continued. He had been careful. He had left no direct connection between himself and the necklace, relying on the intermediary of an old man in poor health who would, he calculated, not speak, and a family physician who had compromised himself sufficiently that speaking would be dangerous. He attended the ball last night from outside it, on the terrace in the dark, to ensure that the mechanism was engaged, that the clasp was correctly positioned, that his plan, which he had constructed with the patience and precision of his father's craft, would execute without error. He stopped. It did execute without error, he said, and Vivienne Ashworth died on the dance floor of her grandmother's ballroom, wearing the necklace that should have been her inheritance, while the orchestra played the Last Waltz, and none of us who were in that room were able to prevent it. The room was very quiet. Poirot looked at his hands for a moment, a rare gesture for a man who usually held his stillness so completely. Then he looked up. "I made errors," he said. "I should say this clearly because it is true. I observed the anteroom had been occupied, and I stood at the window thinking about it for 2 minutes longer than I should have. 2 minutes in which I might have returned to the ballroom. 2 minutes in which, perhaps, I might have noticed something that would have prompted me to act." He paused. "I did not, and I have been a detective long enough to know that these are the calculations one must make and then set aside, because the other calculation, the one in which everything goes differently, in which one is faster or smarter or in the right place at the right moment, that calculation is comfortable and useless in equal measure." He looked at Lady Ashworth when he said this. She met his eyes with the steadiness of a woman who had been making her own version of the same calculation since midnight. "The case is not mine to conclude," Poirot said. "It belongs to Inspector Crome and to the courts. Edward Crane is in custody. The evidence against him is substantial. His father's craftwork is identifiable and will be identified. The compound used will be traced. These things are slower than we would like, but they are certain." He looked at Hartley. "Doctor, Hartley will make a full statement. He will face whatever consequence the law determines is appropriate. I have expressed to Inspector Crome my view that his culpability, while real, is of a different order from Crane's. The inspector will make his own assessment." Crome by the fireplace said nothing, but he gave a small, precise nod that meant he had heard. The room began slowly to empty. Crome took Hartley first, and then spoke quietly with Roland for several minutes. Roland, who had come closest, of all of them, to being destroyed by this night without having done anything to deserve it, and who looked, as he left the room, like a man who had been handed an unexpected bill for something he had not ordered and was still deciding how he felt about it. Clara Bryce paused in the doorway and looked back at Poirot. "She wasn't afraid," Clara said quietly, the same words she had used last night. She really wasn't afraid. She thought she was in control of all of it. "Yes," Poirot said. "She did." Clara nodded, as though this confirmed something she had been trying to decide. Then she left. Anthony Hale was last, except for Lady Ashworth. He stopped beside Poirot and looked at him for a moment with his dark, restless eyes and said, "If I had told someone last night what I heard in the corridor—" "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Perhaps not." The mechanism was already engaged. The clasp was already positioned. Whether the outcome would have been different. He shook his head. "I do not know. What I know is that you returned to the ballroom as quickly as you could, and that you stayed beside her for the remaining time you had." He paused. "That is not nothing either, Mr. Hale." Hale looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once and left. The drawing-room was quiet now, except for the fire and the failing light, and Lady Ashworth, still in her chair by the window, looking out at the December garden where the frost had not lifted all day. Poirot sat down across from her. He did not speak immediately. There are moments that deserve to be entered slowly, and this was one. "You knew," he said at last, "this morning, when you told me about Crane, you had known for some time. Perhaps not the full extent of it, but enough. Enough to suspect what the modification might mean beyond the insurance scheme." Lady Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected," she said, "when Clara told me about the clasp. When I received her letter, I did not only think of the insurance scheme. I thought about Edward Crane, about what Vivienne had told me of him years ago when that relationship ended, about the kind of man he was." She paused. "I invited you, Monsieur Poirot. I thought, I hoped, that your presence might prevent something, or that I was wrong, that it would turn out to be nothing, and you would have a pleasant evening, and I would feel foolish for worrying." "And you still let Vivienne wear the necklace," Poirot said. He said it gently, but he said it. Lady Ashworth closed her eyes. She insisted. "When I raised the possibility of not wearing it, she was very certain. She said there was no danger. She said everything was managed." She opened her eyes. She was so very certain. Monsieur Poirot. She was always so very certain. From the time she was a small girl, it was the thing about her that I loved most and worried about most in equal measure. Her absolute certainty that she understood a situation completely. A pause. "I should have been firmer. I have told myself this since midnight, and I expect I will continue telling myself for a considerable time." "Yes," Poirot said. He did not offer comfort that would have been false. Lady Ashworth was not a woman who wanted false comfort. "You should have been firmer." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, a fractional easing, the way a muscle releases when the tension that has been held in it is acknowledged rather than denied. "You are a very honest man, Monsieur Poirot." "I try to be," he said. "It is not always comfortable." "No." She looked back at the window. "No, I imagine it is not." Outside, the December dark had fully arrived now. The frost-white garden was invisible, replaced by the black reflection of the lit room in the glass. The two of them, the fire, the lamps, all superimposed on the dark garden beyond. Poirot looked at the reflection for a moment. Then he looked at the room itself, the real one, solid and particular and exact. "The necklace," he said. "It will be returned to you eventually, when the legal processes are complete." "Yes." She did not look at it. "I think," she said, "that I shall have it broken up, the stones sold. The gold," she paused. "Something has happened around it that does not come off, that cannot be cleaned away." She looked at Poirot. "Do you think that is foolish? Sentimental?" "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that there are objects that carry too much history to be comfortably held. And I think that the people who understand this are not sentimental, but wise." Lady Ashworth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Poirot. I am sorry it was not the pleasant evening I had hoped." "I am sorry also," he said, and meant it. He left Ashworth Manor at 6 o'clock. The hired car was waiting at the end of the gravel drive, its headlamps cutting two pale cones through the December dark. The torches that had lined the drive the previous evening were gone, their brackets empty, the gravel scattered and ordinary in the lamplight. Poirot walked the length of the drive slowly. His knees, after 2 days of exceptional demands, were registering their objections with some force. He paid them the attention they deserved, which was to say very little. He thought about Vivian Ashworth, who had been 26 and brilliant and reckless and absolutely certain she had understood a situation completely. He thought about Edward Crane eating his lunch in a public house 4 miles away with the composed appetite of a man who believes himself invisible, and who had not been. He thought about the little grey cells, those faithful, tireless instruments, and the 2 minutes he had spent at the anteroom window thinking, when he might have been moving. He had been a detective for a very long time. Long enough to know that the little grey cells were excellent, and that they were not infallible, and that the difference between those two things was sometimes, as it had been last night, the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late. He reached the car. The driver opened the door, the warm interior smelling of leather and the faint ghost of someone's cigarette from a previous journey received him. Poirot settled himself, straightened his coat, touched the tips of his mustaches once with a gloved finger. Then he looked back at Ashworth Manor, rising against the December sky, all grey stone and dark windows, its east wing climbing ivy gone the colour of dried blood, exactly as it had appeared to him 24 hours ago, when he had stepped from this same car and thought, with the slightly uneasy aesthetic instinct of a man who notices things very grand, perhaps a little too grand. He had been right about that, at least. The car moved down the drive. The manor receded. The December dark closed in around it, and presently the gate was behind them, and the country road was ahead, and Ashworth Manor was only a glow of lit windows diminishing in the rear window. Poirot turned forward. The case of the Sapphire Death Waltz was for all practical purposes concluded. The courts would do what the courts do, in their slow and thorough way. Crane would be tried. Hartley would face his accounting. The Ashworth family would do what old families do with the damage that life inflicts on them. Absorb it, carry it, and continue. And Hercule Poirot would return to Whitehaven Mansions, and his armchair and his tisanis, and the precise orderly comfort of a life, arranged exactly as he preferred it, with everything parallel to everything else, and the small symmetries of daily routine undisturbed. Until the next envelope arrived, the next telephone call, with something underneath the practiced lightness, the next gathering of people in a room from which someone would not be leaving. He settled back into the leather seat. Outside, the December countryside moved past in the dark. The little grey cells, satisfied for now, rested.